On April 12th, 2022, the governor of a country's own central bank stood in front of cameras and said something almost no government official ever says out loud. He said his country could no longer pay its bills. $51 billion in debt, and Sri Lanka was done pretending it could make the payments. Within 3 months, the president of that country had fled his own capital in the middle of the night. Protesters had stormed his official residence, swum in his pool, and cooked meals in his kitchen while he was in hiding. A nation of 22 million people, one that had been held up for decades as a genuine development success story in South Asia, had run out of fuel, run out of medicine, and very nearly run out of food, all within the span of a few catastrophic months. Sri Lanka wasn't supposed to be the country this happened to. Unlike so many nations that make headlines for economic collapse, this wasn't a country crippled by war, cut off by international sanctions, or governed by a regime the rest of the world had already written off. Sri Lanka had decent literacy rates, a growing middle class, a tourism industry that international travelers genuinely loved, and, for years, GDP growth that averaged over 5% annually. It was the kind of country economists pointed to as evidence that South Asian nations could climb the development ladder. And then, over roughly 3 years, it fell off that ladder entirely, faster and more completely than almost anyone outside the country saw coming. Picture what that actually looked like for ordinary people. Because the statistics alone don't quite capture it. Nurses performing surgery by phone flashlight during blackouts, parents skipping meals so their children could eat, commuters spending entire days waiting in fuel lines just to get to work the following week. This wasn't a distant financial abstraction playing out on a trading floor somewhere. It was a functioning modern economy, grinding to a halt in real time, in front of the entire world, streamed live on social media by the very people living through it. So here's the question worth actually answering. Not the easy version, the real one. How does a functioning country go bankrupt this fast? Was it one policy, one president, one bad decision? Or was it something slower and more complicated that finally arrived all at once? The way a bridge doesn't collapse because of the last truck that crosses it, but because of every single truck that crossed it before. This is endgame analysis. If you want the real answer, backed by the actual data, not the version that fits neatly into a single villain, stick around because it's more complicated and more useful than most coverage of this story ever bothered to explain. And if breakdowns like this are your kind of thing, go ahead and subscribe to Endgame Analysis right now, because we're about to walk through exactly how a country runs out of money, one decision at a time. If you want to understand how fast a functioning economy can collapse, start with a single policy that, on paper, sounded almost noble. In 2021, with foreign currency reserves already under serious strain, the Rajapaksa government made a decision that stunned agricultural economists around the world. It banned all chemical fertilizer imports overnight and declared Sri Lanka the first 100% organic farming nation on Earth. The stated goal was genuinely appealing: healthier soil, reduced dependency on imported chemicals, and, critically, less foreign currency spent on fertilizer imports at a moment when every dollar of reserves mattered. What actually happened was immediate and brutal. Sri Lankan farmers, given no meaningful transition period and no proven organic alternative at the scale the country's agriculture actually required, watched their yields collapse almost instantly. Rice production fell by 20% in a single growing cycle, and a country that had been fully self-sufficient in rice for years was suddenly forced to start importing it, the exact opposite of what the policy was designed to achieve. Tea and rubber, two of Sri Lanka's most important export crops, and among its largest sources of foreign currency earnings, saw productivity drop sharply as well, which meant the country wasn't just losing money on new imports, it was simultaneously earning less from the exports that were supposed to be bringing foreign currency in. The government reversed the ban in November of 2021, just months after implementing it, an admission that the policy hadn't worked. But the damage to that year's harvest, and to the foreign exchange reserves the policy was originally supposed to protect, was already locked in. Sri Lanka ended up needing to import both fertilizer and food at exactly the moment its reserves could least afford either one. It's hard to find a cleaner, more self-contained example anywhere in modern economic history of a well-intentioned policy producing precisely the outcome it was designed to prevent. There's a detail about the fertilizer ban that deserves particular attention because it explains why the failure was so fast and so total rather than gradual. Sri Lankan agriculture, like most modern farming systems, had been built around chemical fertilizer inputs for decades. Soil chemistry, crop rotation schedules, and farmer training had all developed around that assumption. Switching an entire nation's agricultural base to organic methods isn't something that can be done successfully with a single policy announcement and a few months' notice. It typically requires years of soil transition, new farmer training, and careful, gradual scaling. The Rajapaksa government attempted to compress what agricultural economists generally agree should be a multi-year transition into a matter of weeks, with predictably catastrophic results for the harvest that followed almost immediately. The human cost of that miscalculation extended well beyond the balance sheet. Sri Lankan farmers, many of them already operating on thin margins, watched an entire season's income evaporate almost overnight, with no compensation program adequate to the scale of what they'd lost. Some agricultural economists have since pointed to the fertilizer ban as a case study taught, specifically as a warning about the dangers of implementing sweeping structural policy changes without a realistic transition timeline, regardless of how sound the underlying goal might be. Organic farming itself wasn't the problem. The problem was trying to force an entire national agricultural system through that transition in the span of a single growing season, with the country's foreign currency reserves as the thing being gambled on the outcome. If a single, self-inflicted policy disaster like that surprises you, wait until you see what was happening to the government's own finances at the exact same time, because the fertilizer ban wasn't an isolated mistake. It was one piece of a much larger pattern. And if you're finding this breakdown useful so far, now is a good moment to hit subscribe on EndGame Analysis, because the deeper we go into this, the more the pieces start connecting to each other. Here's the part of the story that gets less attention than the fertilizer ban, but arguably did more structural damage, because it happened right before the country needed access to global credit markets more than ever. In 2019, the newly elected Rajapaksa government slashed Sri Lanka's value-added tax from 15% down to 8%, a major, sweeping tax cut implemented as a populist economic stimulus. The effect on government revenue was immediate and severe. Sri Lanka's tax-to-GDP ratio, already one of the lowest in the world at around 8% even before this cut, fell further, leaving the government collecting a smaller share of the country's economic output than almost any other nation on earth. The consequences compounded quickly. By 2020, credit rating agencies had downgraded Sri Lanka to a substantial risk investment category, a classification that effectively slammed the door on the country's access to international financial markets right as the COVID-19 pandemic was about to devastate its tourism industry, one of its largest sources of foreign currency. Think about the timing. Here, because it matters enormously. Sri Lanka cut its own primary revenue stream in 2019, got locked out of international borrowing markets in 2020 as a direct result, and then watched its tourism and remittance income collapse under COVID-19 later that same year, all while it still had to keep making payments on its existing foreign debt in dollars it increasingly didn't have. This is the pattern worth understanding about Sri Lanka's collapse before we go any further. It wasn't a single catastrophic event. It was a series of decisions and shocks that each, individually, might have been survivable, but that landed on top of each other in a way that removed every available cushion at once. Historically, instead of bringing government spending in line with what it actually collected in revenue, Sri Lankan politicians across multiple administrations had preferred to simply borrow the difference, a habit that worked fine for years, right up until the moment it didn't. If you're the kind of person who wants the full, unfiltered chain of decisions rather than a headline villain, subscribing to EndGame Analysis now means you won't miss where this goes next. It's worth asking why a government would cut taxes so sharply right as a global pandemic was clearly becoming a serious possibility. Part of the answer is straightforwardly political. The tax cut was a signature campaign promise from the 2019 election, framed as relief for ordinary Sri Lankans and a boost for struggling businesses, and delivering on it quickly was seen as an early political win for the newly elected government. What that decision didn't account for was how quickly the country's fiscal position could deteriorate once external conditions turned against it, and how little room a government with a shrinking revenue base would have to respond when they did. The government running a comfortable fiscal surplus can absorb a shock like COVID-19 by temporarily increasing borrowing without triggering a crisis of confidence among its creditors. A government that has just voluntarily gutted its own revenue base heading into that same shock has almost no such room to maneuver, and international credit markets, watching closely, priced that vulnerability in almost immediately through the 2020 downgrade. This is the part of Sri Lanka's collapse that gets cited constantly online, usually in an oversimplified way, so it's worth walking through carefully with the actual numbers. By the time of the default, Sri Lanka owed foreign lenders more than $51 billion. A meaningful share of that debt, and one of the most consequential examples, involved China. Years earlier, Sri Lanka had borrowed heavily from Chinese state lenders to fund large infrastructure projects, including the Hambantota Port, a massive deep water port project in the south of the country. When Sri Lanka couldn't keep up with the payments on that specific debt, It handed over the port itself to China on a 99-year lease, an arrangement that has since become one of the most widely cited examples anywhere in the world of what critics call Chinese trap diplomacy. A strategically important piece of national infrastructure effectively signed away because a loan couldn't be repaid. Here's the detail that most viral versions of this story leave out, and it matters for actually understanding what happened, rather than just repeating a scary headline. China was a significant creditor, but it was not, by itself, the dominant source of Sri Lanka's total external debt. The single largest category of Sri Lanka's $51 billion in obligations was actually international market. Borrowings, meaning bonds sold to private investors and financial institutions around the world, not loans from any single foreign government. China sat alongside major lenders like the Asian Development Bank, Japan, and India in the broader creditor mix. The Hambantota Port arrangement is real, it did happen, and it remains a legitimate and troubling case study in how debt-financed infrastructure can go badly wrong for a borrowing nation. But treating it as the single explanation for Sri Lanka's entire $51 billion collapse flattens a much more complicated financial picture into a simpler story than the actual data supports. What the debt picture really shows is a country that, across multiple governments and administrations, consistently chose to fund ambitious infrastructure and development projects through heavy borrowing rather than through the tax revenue way. It was simultaneously choosing to cut from multiple lenders and multiple currencies without building the kind of foreign exchange reserve cushion that would let it absorb a genuine external shock when one eventually arrived. And in 2019 through 2022, several genuine external shocks arrived, one after another in rapid succession. If this is the kind of nuance you want more of in the geopolitical and economic stories you follow, subscribing to EndGame analysis means you'll catch every future breakdown like this one the moment it goes live. Even with every policy mistake we've covered so far, Sri Lanka's economy might conceivably have absorbed the damage and recovered if it hadn't also been hit by a genuinely brutal sequence of external shocks, each one arriving before the last one had been fully absorbed. In April of 2019, terrorist bombings on Easter Sunday targeted churches and hotels across Sri Lanka, killing more than 250 people and devastating the country's tourism industry almost overnight, an industry that had been one of the fastest growing and most important sources of foreign currency for the entire economy. Tourism arrivals collapsed, and with them, one of Sri Lanka's most reliable dollar-earning sectors went quiet for years. Then, in 2020, before tourism had any real chance to recover, COVID-19 arrived and finished the job. International travel essentially stopped worldwide. Remittances from Sri Lankans working abroad, another critical source of foreign currency, dropped sharply as the global economy seized up. Colombo still had to service its existing foreign debt throughout this entire period, in dollars, even as the dollars coming into the country from tourism and remittances had nearly disappeared. Imports kept flowing in because the country still needed fuel, medicine, and food, while the foreign currency needed to pay for those imports kept draining out of the central bank's reserves at an accelerating rate. Then, in February of 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine and global fuel and grain prices spiked sharply, right as Sri Lanka's foreign reserves were already approaching zero. Inflation, which had been climbing steadily, hit 17.5% that same month and kept accelerating from there, eventually reaching close to 70% annually at the peak of the crisis a few months later. Food inflation alone surged past 57% by May of 2022. None of these three shocks, the Easter bombings, the pandemic, or the war in Ukraine, were decisions made by Sri Lanka's government. But the reason each one hit so much harder than it needed to is that the government's own earlier choices, the tax cuts, the borrowing habits, the fertilizer ban, had already stripped away nearly every buffer the country would otherwise have had to absorb a genuine external crisis. By early 2022, the human cost of all of this had become impossible to ignore or manage through official channels. The World Bank estimated that more than 500,000 Sri Lankans had fallen below the poverty line as the crisis deepened. Daily, blackouts became routine as the country couldn't afford enough fuel to keep power plants running consistently. Schools shut their doors because there was no reliable electricity to keep them open. Long, desperate lines formed outside gas stations, sometimes for days at a time, for fuel that frequently ran out before everyone in line could be served. The government at the center of all of this was, for 2 decades, dominated by a single political family. Gotabaya Rajapaksa served as president. His brother, Mahinda Rajapaksa, served as prime minister. Other family members held additional senior positions throughout the administration. For years, that concentration of power had drawn persistent accusations of corruption, nepotism, and increasingly authoritarian governance from critics both inside and outside Sri Lanka, accusations that intensified sharply once the economic crisis made the consequences of that governance impossible to hide behind official statistics any longer. In March and April of 2022, protests began building in Colombo, and they didn't stop. By May, Mahinda Rajapaksa had resigned as prime minister. By July, tens of thousands of protesters had stormed the presidential residence directly, and the images that came out of that occupation, ordinary Sri Lankans swimming in the president's pool, cooking in his kitchen, lounging in his private rooms, became some of the defining images of political upheaval anywhere in the world that year. Gotabaya Rajapaksa fled the country on July 13th, initially to the Maldives, then eventually further abroad, before resigning. The presidency from exile days later. A government that had dominated Sri Lankan politics for 2 decades collapsed in the span of a few months, not because of a foreign invasion or a natural disaster, but because its own accumulated economic decisions had finally run out of runway all at once. What makes that collapse especially striking is how thoroughly it happened without a single shot fired between organized armed factions, without a coup in any traditional sense, and without a foreign power forcing the outcome. It was, fundamentally, an economic crisis that became a political crisis purely through the accumulated weight of ordinary people no longer being able to access fuel, food, and medicine, channeled into sustained public pressure that no amount of political dominance built up over 2 decades could withstand once daily survival itself became the issue at stake. That's a pattern worth remembering. Governments rarely fall from a single scandal. They fall when enough of the population simultaneously concludes that the system itself has stopped working for them. Here's the part of this story that most coverage from 2022 never got to include, because it hadn't happened yet, and it's genuinely one of the more useful parts of the whole narrative, because it shows collapse isn't necessarily permanent. In March of 2023, the IMF approved a $2.9 billion extended fund facility program for Sri Lanka, its 17th IMF program in the country's history, built around 5 core pillars: fiscal consolidation through tax reform, restoring debt sustainability through restructuring, rebuilding foreign exchange reserves, safeguarding external stability, and a genuine anti-corruption reform agenda. As of the program's combined 5th and 6th reviews, completed in May of 2026, the IMF's own assessment describes Sri Lanka as having stabilized its economy across 3 separate dimensions: growth, government revenue, and inflation. The actual numbers back that assessment up. Economic growth has averaged roughly 5% over the past 2 years, a dramatic turnaround from the near 8% contraction the economy suffered at the depth of the crisis in 2022. Tax revenue as a share of GDP has nearly doubled, climbing from around 7.3% to nearly 15% in 2025. Direct evidence that the fiscal discipline missing for decades before the crisis is finally being enforced. Inflation, which peaked close to 70% annually during the worst months of the crisis, has fallen all the way to somewhere between 2 and 3% as of early 2026. Foreign exchange reserves, which had collapsed to nearly zero in 2022, forcing the fuel and medicine shortages that defined the crisis, have more than doubled, climbing past $9 billion. India played a significant, often underreported role in this recovery as well, providing roughly $4.5 billion in emergency assistance since 2022, covering fuel, food, medicine, and credit lines that helped stabilize the country's supply chains during the most acute phase of the shortage crisis, alongside the longer-term IMF-led reform program. None of this means the story is simply over, and it's worth being honest about that, rather than wrapping this up with a falsely tidy ending. Growth is projected to slow to around 3 to 3.5% in 2026, partly due to the aftermath of Cyclone Ditwa, which struck in late 2025 and caused significant reconstruction costs, and partly due to rising oil prices and reduced tourism, linked to conflict in the Middle East. Sri Lanka's debt-to-GDP ratio, while falling, still sits above 100%, and a significant wave of capital debt repayments is scheduled to come due in 2028, a deadline that will test whether the reforms of the past several years have built enough of a genuine cushion to handle the next real test, rather than simply riding out a temporary period of favorable conditions. If Sri Lanka's next few years interest you as much as its collapse did, that's exactly the kind of follow-up story EndGame analysis exists to keep tracking, so make sure you're subscribed before we get to it. There's also a harder, less quantifiable question hanging over all of this progress: whether the specific vulnerabilities that caused the 2022 collapse have actually been fixed, or merely patched over under close IMF supervision. Tax-to-GDP ratios can be raised under a reform program and then quietly eroded again by the next populist government looking for an easy win, the same way the 2019 VAT cut happened in the first place. Debt restructuring buys time and reduces immediate payment pressure. But it doesn't retroactively undo the underlying habit of borrowing more than the country could comfortably service. The genuine test of whether Sri Lanka has learned the actual lesson of 2022, rather than simply survived its consequences, will come the next time a populist government is tempted to cut taxes, resume unsustainable borrowing, or roll back reforms for short-term political gain, and whether the institutions built during this recovery are strong enough to resist that temptation where the ones before 2019 clearly weren't. Here's the honest answer, the one that doesn't fit neatly onto a protest sign or into a single viral headline, because the real version of this story involves more than one villain, spread out across more than one decade. Blame the fertilizer ban, a well-intentioned environmental policy implemented with no viable transition plan that gutted the two most important export crops and its own food self-sufficiency in a single growing season. Blame the 2019 tax cuts, which stripped away government revenue at the exact moment the country's access to global credit markets, and soon its tourism income were about to become critical. Blame decades of borrow-first fiscal habits across multiple governments, not just one, that left Sri Lanka without the reserve cushion any country needs to survive a genuine external shock. Blame the specific, real, well-documented case of the Hambantota port, while also being honest that China wasn't the single dominant creditor behind the broader 51 billion dollar collapse market bondholders were. Blame the Easter Sunday bombings, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the war in Ukraine, three genuinely external shocks that Sri Lanka's government didn't cause, but that landed on an economy stripped of every buffer that might otherwise have absorbed them. And blame 2 decades of concentrated political power inside a single family, a governance structure that made it far easier for these accumulated mistakes to go uncorrected for as long as they did. That's not a satisfying answer if you were hoping for one clean villain to point at, but it's the accurate one, and it's also the more useful one, because a single villain's story teaches you almost nothing you can apply anywhere else. A multi-decade chain of tax cuts, borrowing habits, policy overreach, and inadequate reserves, compounded by real external shocks the government had no control over, is a pattern that shows up in different forms, in country after country facing debt distress right now. Sri Lanka isn't a uniquely reckless nation that brought a freak disaster on itself. It's a case study in exactly how many individually survivable decisions it actually takes to add up to something that isn't survivable at all. Keep that in mind the next time a headline tells you some country suddenly defaulted or unexpectedly ran out of foreign currency. Somewhere underneath that headline is almost always a multi-year sequence just like this one, tax policy, borrowing habits, and 1 or 2 genuinely unlucky external shocks that most people only start paying attention to after the collapse has already made the news. If this breakdown gave you a clearer, more complete picture than the headlines usually offer, subscribe to EndGame Analysis, because we're going to keep tracking Sri Lanka's recovery and every other country currently walking the same tightrope it once fell off of. Tell me in the comments, out of everything covered here, the fertilizer ban, the tax cuts, the debt, the external shocks, or the Rajapaksa family's grip on power, which one do you think mattered most? I read every comment, and they shape what we cover next. This has been EndGame Analysis. Stay sharp.